All right. So, dynamite fishing, or grenade fishing in this guy's case, any kind of concussive or percussive fishing, highly impactful. Sure is a lot of fun, right? God bless America's military. Let's talk about the different dynamics of impacts to water that we create specifically as a function of recreation. And we want to think of these or categorize these in terms of endogenous, so internal to your park's boundary, versus exogenous, exogen, outside, made from. Here we go. So, we have in our earlier PowerPoint already talked about turbulence and turbidity. So turbulence is the water flowing in a laminar way or a turbulent way. So is it flowing smoothly or is it tumbling with lots of drag and chaos? Or is it smooth? Smooth is called laminar. Turbulent is the other. Where we have prop wash, right? That's going to cause a lot of that shoreline erosion, but it can also wreak havoc among marginal macrophytes. So macrophytes, plants growing on the edge or the margin of a water body. That wake energy is more than they are evolved or adapted or designed, depending on your theology, to handle. And so motorboats going through an area can really wreck a lot of shoreline around them. Now think of all of the amphibians and reptiles and insects and everything else. There are a lot of shore denning birds, for example. We saw some kingfisher on the class field trip this year at Ozark City Riverways. All of those things are dependent on the very fine balance or range of energy inputs in the form of wash or wake energy, wave energy. They're all finely tuned mechanisms in terms of survival in that very thin strip of shoreline. So when we add motorboats to the system, wiping out any part of that can wipe out all of the rest as that system collapses, and then you've just got a bare and rapidly eroding shoreline or bank. All right. Unfortunately, we're going to have to deal with motor boats running over large aquatic, brackish, marine mammals like manatees, dugongs, dolphins, sea cows, etc. And those impacts get pretty horrific looking. We'll take a look at a couple of examples of that. Hull material transfer is where, if you've ever been like canoeing in an aluminum or fiberglass canoe, and you drag your boat over the bottom on the rocks, and you leave a little bit of the canoe behind on the rocks. Depending on the material, right? Aluminum is the metal in a whole lot of the rocks, aluminosilicates, like bauxite, that the entire southeastern United States are made of. So adding a little bit of aluminum back to those watery ecosystems, not going to kill anything. But other kinds of hull materials are not native to that space, right? So if you've ever scraped the bottom of a plastic kayak, well, that's a whole bunch of macro, micro, and nanoplastics now in that system. Same thing goes for carbon fiber, which has some pretty ruinous health effects in humans. If we breathe in carbon fiber, carbon nanotubes, pyrolyzed carbon, it is really bad for you. But we don't necessarily see that in wildlife because we're not looking for it. So that is a thing that we are paying attention to now, at least. For egg trampling in shoreline or very shallow water systems, like in, anybody know how like catfish do their thing? Has anybody ever been hogging or noodling before? All right, so in places like the Big Muddy, for example, we'll have these just holes in the underwater environment of the bank, and big old catfish will sort of dig those out. They'll find them. They'll lay a bunch of eggs in there, and so
catfishing by hand is like sticking your hand in the hole, hoping it goes into the catfish's open mouth. You pull the catfish out, you have this massive catfish, and probably wearing a camel hat with a big old fish hook on it, because that's how life is done. And hopefully it's not a snapping turtle that you're sticking your hand down into. But a whole bunch of species, including catfish, lay very, very, very fragile eggs right where people like to go wading or hogging or whatever. And so egg trampling is absolutely a thing. So a lot of places just won't let you wade. When we were at Ozark Scenic Riverways at Big Spring, we could go pretty much anywhere there, but we couldn't go right down to the water's edge because that's where all of that action is. And it's for reasons like egg trampling. Shark and dolphin netting. So in places like around the very popular, very busy beaches of Australia, they have miles and miles and miles of shark netting because it's open to the open ocean, and shark attacks down there are a big downer, you know. I don't know if they get great whites on the coast of Australia or not. I know that's at least South Africa. But we'll get a lot of other bycatch out of that, and the only reason that those shark nets are there is for ocean recreation purposes. So all the dolphins that we kill in those shark nets, that's kind of on us wanting to do recreation in that particular place. Okay, so we've already talked about turbidity. We're not going to talk too much about that. When you're running, in particular, swamp tractors across marshy or swampy or boggy areas, or estuarine systems where fresh and salty water are mixing, so there's medium levels of salinity. That's called an estuarine system. Again, that soil is super soft, and so we can cut slit trenches or incisions horizontally through that system, and this is what that looks like. So this is at Big Cypress down in the southeast. And we talked briefly earlier in this class how swamp tractors, mud boggers, folks like this example using tractor tires on a Suburban. This is off of the Red Green Show, if you guys are familiar with that. If they don't find you handsome, at least let them find you handy, right? That guy. Like, this is lots of fun, but each of these tires in that very, very soft soil, to the extent that the balloon tires are not floating the vehicle enough, you can cut a 3 or 4 foot deep and 12-inch wide slit trench everywhere you go on both sides of the vehicle. And so what that does is it stops water from flowing naturally across the surface. The water gets stuck in these ruts and starts flowing along the ruts and maybe completely diverted and just destroying the downslope ecosystem on the far side. It's a subtle process, but this was observable from space, and so they had to shut this down. The management response to this is shut it down when you cannot make it sustainable, and or find some smaller section of the place, don't let folks go wild across the whole thing, and just use that area as a sacrifice zone. Say, yeah, we're going to absolutely beat this to death, but it sure is going to be fun, but let's leave all the rest of this wide open and healthy and naturally flowing. Okay? So, these mud holes, they're everywhere that vehicles and people are, or horses, right, just everywhere. So here's the human-powered version of exactly the same thing, hydrologically speaking. So places like Tuolumne Meadow here at Yosemite National Park, right? These little slit trenches that are the hiking trail get muddy, so people walk next to the mud because they don't want to walk through the mud. And now we have 3 chances to trap the water as it's trying to flow from the high side to the low side. And all of our wildflowers and all of the insect communities and so forth, butterflies, for example, that are utterly dependent on this very finely balanced water transfer from the upper watershed, those mountains in the background, to the bottom sides of these meadows. Because these trails are along the upslope edge of the meadows, we're cutting off the entire rest of the meadow and drying it out. Non-native invasive species love that kind of disturbance, right? So we dry out the meadow and you get a bunch of non-native stuff choking out the native wildflowers, and the system collapses. So the Park Service had to work really hard on this. This is a super, super beautiful, popular area for hiking. All right. So this is sort of the wet area equivalent of Carlsbad Caverns from our earlier discussion. Here where we do have a lot of rain, pervious and impervious surfaces, so roofs, parking lots, and so forth, the more pavement we have, because we don't use a lot of pervious surfaces, it's much more expensive, means we have to do stormwater management, and we have to do stormwater management differently than if this were an unpaved area, like a forest floor, for example, which is going to do a great job of spreading out that hydrograph, flattening that peak, stopping the flash flood from happening. We're just going to have to deal with that now, right? And so largely most national parks are pretty well on top of this within their national park space. But typically a lot of these gateway communities right outside the national park are big and growing, and so we got to deal with an exogenous pressure on the hydrograph. All right. We also got to deal with damming federal waterways. So the way this has played out in the United States is that we dam waterways to generate water, or generate a steady supply of water to generate electricity, and to regularize and normalize flows for things like locks and dams. And then we use a bunch of those places for recreation as a result. So the Colorado River alone is just a real fustercluck of archaic, not ecologically minded land management policy, water rights policy. And just on this one river, we have Flaming Gorge, Aspinall, Glen Canyon, we have Dinosaur National Monument, Black Canyon of the Gunnison, Canyonlands National Park, Glen Canyon National Rec Area, Grand Canyon National Park, right? This is a mess. And everybody wants to get to these places. These are amazing. And they're all dependent on the same spot. And so the Park Service, very famously inside the Grand Canyon, managing the Colorado inside the Grand Canyon, had to work with Army Corps of Engineers at Glen Canyon Dam to set up a system of dam releases every year that mimicked natural flooding regime, because it was totally wrecking the ecosystem down inside of the Grand Canyon wilderness area where the Colorado's flowing through there, because the flows were, for a period of time after the Glen Canyon Dam was finished, just super normalized that. There was never any flooding because they were trying to fill up the Glen Canyon basin, Lake Powell, which is now an awesome place to go recreate. It's amazing and ridiculous. It is a testament to American and human hubris. That's incredible. Just in the middle of the desert, this big fucking lake. Yeah. It's like, let's turn this worthless, horrible desert into a really sick beach. So we did. For better and worse, in my opinion. All right. So again, when you dam the Colorado River, you get disconnected floodplains, insufficient flow to scour out sediment, and so sediment starts piling up and choking off the river bottom. You get stale debris fans. So in Grand Canyon, this is stuff that should be flushed down the river with every high pulse flow. Every annual flood should take some of these gravel bars, some of these sandbars, and just rip them up and yeet them downstream. That was not happening. We call those stale debris fans. And in Glen Canyon and at Grand Canyon, there are a ton of archaeology sites that are now underwater. And that's that. They are permanently altered by the chemical reaction of this so-called bathtub ring effect of water soaking those places. And some folks try to sort of extend an olive branch with that controversy by saying, okay, so we can't destroy, we can't pull apart, we can't steal a bunch of artifacts from Native American like cliff dwelling sites that are underwater, so we're kind of protecting them for the future, because Glen Canyon will not live forever. Glen Canyon Dam won't live forever, so Lake Powell won't be a thing forever and ever. So maybe we're sort of, saving some of these sites for future generations. I don't buy that for a second. But anyway, that is how the argument has gone. It's a mess. So if any of you guys want to go out to the mythical land of milk and honey, where the recreationists flock like the salmon of Capistrano, and move out to like Utah or Arizona in the space on the in the Red Rocks country, just be prepared for some absolute insanity in how people want to live in some dry places like St. George, Utah, the fastest growing metropolitan area in the United States and one of the driest. So we as a country have decided that we need things like Hoover Dam, like Glen Canyon Dam. If you don't necessarily buy that whole discussion and you think we might be better off without all of these dams, then read a book by Ed Abbey called The Monkey Wrench Gang. We'll leave it at that. So, if you modify any watercourse with something like an impoundment, a dam, an earthwork, a dike, check dams, sluice gates, any of that stuff, be prepared for everything downstream to be radically altered. So typically we are not doing these things for the purposes of recreation, or at least forest recreation. Outdoor recreation, like at Lake Powell, we decided as a country we had to have the dam, and so let's put a bunch of motorboats on it because we've got the space and the water now for that, while we're generating electricity for the rural Southwest and a bunch of Native American nations. So, here's one example of wake energy. Pretty sick locks on that guy, huh? Also, pretty sick wave erosion. Anyway, moving on. This is what the cumulative or accumulating effects of that kind of wake energy, so a motorboat, that's what your shoreline is going to end up looking like. So this is wholesale sheet erosion, and all of this soil is now down in this water, filling in that benthic macroinvertebrate habitat. So those little nooks and crannies that all these little bugs and creepy crawlies and trout food like to live in, that's all filled in with sand and dirt now. And so that habitat is just gone, which means the trout go away, or whatever other species are present with that. So this wake energy really is that much. It's that powerful. Ladies and gentlemen, Zach Galifianakis for your viewing pleasure. Wake energy, haha. Okay. And we're never going to get away from, again, what some researchers term the joy of movement, right? Like, this is just pants on head stupid. But it's also really fun looking. But it's also really stupid. But it's also really fun, right? So this instinct, this motivation is not going away. We need to recognize that and then figure out maybe we're not going to allow any permits for, like earth movers in our national park for recreation purposes. Yeah. All right, so we got some photos from southern Illinois. This is a bridge over a creek, and this is the low line, the off-roading pass right next to the bridge. Because why use a perfectly good bridge when you can full send it, right? Right. So this is evidence of how people want to use the space versus how the Forest Service, in this particular case, or the National Park Service at your national park, is intending for people to use the space. So, in this case, we make a hard decision. Do we leave this? Do we lean into it and try to make this sustainable, maybe with geoblocks or something like that? Or do we kind of adopt some practices of so-called hostile architecture. We do site ruination. We plant a bunch of pointy rocks where folks are side cutting the official installation. Either answer is okay, depending on the ecological consequences and the cost involved. So it's always a site-by-site evaluation of, okay, so what are we leaning into and what are we really, putting on ice and stopping? There's a million examples of this, so we'll just look at a couple. All right, chemical impacts to water. Whew. This is gonna surprise some of us. I know it surprised me. When we have alpine lakes and people backpack into them, some of these alpine lakes don't have an outflow point. There's no creek running from the bottom of it. And so when you dive in there, all of your Axe body spray and Rogaine with minoxidil and sunblock with octomethoxycinnamate or avobenzone, oxybenzone, some really pretty toxic chemicals. That stuff just sloughs off your body and goes into the lake or pond. If it doesn't have an outflow, it just concentrates. Like after decades of backpackers doing this, alpine researchers and ecologists figured out, wow, we can actually sterilize some of these alpine or subalpine lakes and ponds just by having or allowing recreationists to swim in them with sunblock and bug spray. Right? DEET is pretty nasty stuff. DEET is used to soften plastic, so it can do wild things to or other organic molecules like DNA. And so that stuff washing off into one of these ponds, not a good deal. We've talked about 2-stroke versus 4-stroke engines, and we can have low-key leaks, or very commonly and unfortunately, because people like to go high speed, joy of movement, in natural environments with their vehicles, wrecks, right? So a single wreck can overwhelm or be equivalent or more than equivalent to thousands of slow leaking vehicles in one specific spot, right? So that's involving all kinds of synthetic chemicals, partially combusted chemicals, highly toxic chemicals, so carcinogenic, teratogenic, so tumor-causing compounds. We bring our vehicles to natural places for the purposes of recreation, and the trace that we leave often is chemical pollution. And typically the solution to your pollution is dilution. So systems with a lot of water and regular rains can cope with chemical impacts better. It's still not great, but at least we're sort of washing this stuff out and diluting it quite a bit naturally, because we can't synthetically dilute this stuff. Pumping water is really hard work. We can consider one kind of chemical impact to be carbon loading. So one 2-stroke outboard engine running for 1 day is equivalent to 400 people existing. Right? So next time you're at Wren Lake for the fireworks, whatever, you see a bunch of boats on the water, think each one of those boats multiplied by hundreds of people existing is where we're at. Right? So we get a couple hours of entertainment, leisure, family bonding, core memory formation, and a century plus of hundreds of people worth of carbon loading into the atmosphere. ORVs, because they're smaller engines, they don't have, billions of dollars at this point of industrial research and optimization and engineering in terms of making them extremely efficient and clean burning and stuff like that. They're just smaller, cheaper engines. Even if they're 4-stroke, they just blast out a lot of those chemicals and just raw fuel unburned out the tailpipe. And then in places like Florida, places like coastal everywhere, where cities discharge a city worth of sewage into things like coral reefs, that can overwhelm those coral reefs rapidly. Now we're going to call this another one of those exogenous, so outside of the marine protected area for recreation, like a reef might be. The sewage is not coming from within. It's not a bunch of scuba divers taking a submariner poop on the coral, as far as I know. Maybe that's a thing. I'm sure it's going to go viral at some point. But you still got to deal with it, right? So if you're the ranger in charge of any of these marine protected areas around coral reefs, you're dealing with sewage effluent or discharge from other places coming in. And every once in a while, our really cool mechanized equipment outstrips our ability to think and reason and control our powerful technologies and so forth, right? So this is something that has to be done at Ozark Scenic Riverways, for those of you who went there, at least annually. Some dumbass trying to ford the river in their truck in the riverways, and they get stuck. And we get to deal with the impact, and they get to pay the fine and skip on about their merry lives, and we are left with a degraded area. Or we are all left with a degraded area. The human brain we're not ready. Can you just picture me, like, late at night, surfing the entire internet, looking for just this kind of bullshit, just so I can bring it back to you guys, right? This is my chance to polish the turd of human existence and be like, what can we do about this as park rangers, right? So this is constantly, forever, an issue. Microplastics are a thing. Now, the United States is not largely responsible for the majority of this, but some of our companies are. So Coca-Cola, for example, shipping food containers and single-use plastics all over the world, in particular to Southeast Asian and African countries where waste management infrastructure is not very good. It's not designed or capable for American levels of excess. They discharge into their rivers this waste, and that waste goes into the ocean, right? So this is what that looks like. This is not an AI video, right? And so we're all familiar with the dynamics of sea turtles eating plastic bags because they look like jellyfish and starving to death in that way, right? So every time there is a rain event in developing countries, this is what that looks like. Right, so exogenous plastic trash. This is one of the base camps at Mount Everest. So the government of Nepal is requiring people, as a part of their $75,000 cash permit cost, you are required to bring down a bunch of trash when you descend back down off the rock. For the last century, the idea has been, well, it's so hard to get up there in the first place, we're just gonna throw used oxygen bottles and bags of poop or whatever, just, whip it off the side of the mountain, and it'll be somebody else's problem in 10,000 years when the glacier drops it at the bottom of the valley. That is not a sustainable mindset, right? So it was 15 years ago. It's probably more than that now, yeah. Dude, climbing Mount Everest is pretty nuts, y'all. Let's end class on this. So you can pack up whatever. It's $75 grand. Local terrorist groups have cottoned on to the idea that it's mostly very, very rich Westerners who are even making the attempt to summit Everest. And so terrorist attacks, hostage-taking, ransom gathering is a thing at some of the lower Everest camps. Like, how burly does your life have to be where you're like, all right, my best business plan for today is we're gonna hike partway up this big fucking mountain and hold people at gunpoint and shake them down for money. Yeah. What a time to be alive. Let me just, as you guys are packing up, we're over time, so you can head out if you need to. But this is waste management in a lot of places. Right? And they're doing this on an emergency flood basis so that the extra trash doesn't create extra drag force on the bridge and blow out the bridge and cut off access for this neighborhood. This is in India. All right, so we'll pick it up next time with Pikachu.
I feel like I need to go rewatch Mad Max.